The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport as Sergeant James Wilson adjusted his uniform one last time. His eyes were heavy from the long journey that had started 2 days ago. 15 months away from home, serving in the dusty heat of Afghanistan, and now he was just hours away from hugging his family again. He glanced down at his phone, smiling at the photo of his wife and kids that served as his background. Just one more flight, he whispered to himself. James had been traveling for nearly 30 hours straight. The military transport had taken him from his base to Germany, then another flight to the East Coast, and now this final leg home to Texas. His shoulders ached from carrying his duffel bag, and his eyes burned from lack of sleep, but none of that mattered. He was going home. At the check-in counter, a friendly airline employee had surprised him with an unexpected kindness. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," she'd said, typing something into her computer. "We've upgraded you to first class today." It was a small gesture, but after months of sleeping on hard cots and riding in bumpy military vehicles, the thought of a comfortable seat made James's tired face break into a genuine smile. The terminal buzzed with activity around him. Business people rushed by with coffee cups in hand, families wrangled excited children, and airport staff directed the flow of travelers. James found a quiet spot near his gate and sank into a chair, setting his duffel bag between his feet. A young boy walking by with his father pointed at James's uniform. "Dad, look, a soldier." The father nodded respectfully toward James, who returned the gesture with a smile. These small moments of recognition had become more common since he'd started his journey home, a welcome change from the anonymity of deployment. The boarding announcement came over the loudspeaker, and James joined the line of passengers. His mind wandered to his homecoming. His wife didn't know he was arriving today. He'd managed to get home a week earlier than expected and had kept it secret, planning to surprise her and the kids. He imagined the look on her face when she opened the door to find him standing there. As the line inched forward, James noticed an older couple glancing his way. The gray-haired man stepped out of line and approached him, extending his hand. "Thank you for what you do, son," he said simply. James shook his hand, nodding respectfully. These brief connections with strangers had been happening throughout his journey home, small reminders of the country he'd been serving. When he finally reached the front of the line, the gate agent smiled warmly. "First class is boarding now, Sergeant. You're all set." She handed back his boarding pass with a thankful nod. Walking down the jetway, James felt a mix of excitement and exhaustion. The past 15 months had been filled with challenges, danger, and moments of intense camaraderie with his fellow soldiers. He'd missed birthdays, holidays, and countless everyday moments with his family. But now, finally, that separation was coming to an end. The cool air of the airplane cabin hit his face as he stepped aboard. The flight attendant greeted him with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant. First class is to your left." James nodded gratefully and turned left, moving toward the spacious front section of the plane. After so many months of sacrifice, the simple luxury of a comfortable seat for the final leg of his journey home felt like a fitting transition back to civilian life. As he approached his assigned seat, looking forward to finally resting before the emotional reunion that awaited him, James had no idea that this flight would become memorable for reasons he couldn't yet imagine. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport as Sergeant James Wilson adjusted his uniform one last time. His eyes were heavy from the long journey that had started 2 days ago. 15 months away from home, serving in the dusty heat of Afghanistan, and now he was just hours away from hugging his family again. He glanced down at his phone, smiling at the photo of his wife and kids that served as his background. "Just one more flight," he whispered to himself. James had been traveling for nearly 30 hours straight. The military transport had taken him from his base to Germany, then another flight to the East Coast, and now this final leg home to Texas. His shoulders ached from carrying his duffel bag, and his eyes burned from lack of sleep, but none of that mattered. He was going home. At the check-in counter, a friendly airline employee had surprised him with an unexpected kindness. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," she'd said, typing something into her computer. "We've upgraded you to first class today." It was a small gesture, but after months of sleeping on hard cots and riding in bumpy military vehicles, the thought of a comfortable seat made James's tired face break into a genuine smile. The terminal buzzed with activity around him. Business people rushed by with coffee cups in hand, families wrangled excited children, and airport staff directed the flow of travelers. James found a quiet spot near his gate and sank into a chair, setting his duffel bag between his feet. A young boy walking by with his father pointed at James's uniform. "Dad, look, a soldier." The father nodded respectfully toward James, who returned the gesture with a smile. These small moments of recognition had become more common since he'd started his journey home, a welcome change from the anonymity of deployment. The boarding announcement came over the loudspeaker, and James joined the line of passengers. His mind wandered to his homecoming. His wife didn't know he was arriving today. He'd managed to get home a week earlier than expected and had kept it secret, planning to surprise her and the kids. He imagined the look on her face when she opened the door to find him standing there. As the line inched forward, James noticed an older couple glancing his way. The gray-haired man stepped out of line and approached him, extending his hand. "Thank you for what you do, son," he said simply. James shook his hand, nodding respectfully. These brief connections with strangers had been happening throughout his journey home, small reminders of the country he'd been serving. When he finally reached the front of the line, the gate agent smiled warmly. "First class is boarding now, Sergeant. You're all set." She handed back his boarding pass with a thankful nod. Walking down the jetway, James felt a mix of excitement and exhaustion. The past 15 months had been filled with challenges, danger, and moments of intense camaraderie with his fellow soldiers. He'd missed birthdays, holidays, and countless everyday moments with his family. But now, finally, that separation was coming to an end. The cool air of the airplane cabin hit his face as he stepped aboard. The flight attendant greeted him with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant. First class is to your left." James nodded gratefully and turned left, moving toward the spacious front section of the plane. After so many months of sacrifice, the simple luxury of a comfortable seat for the final leg of his journey home felt like a fitting transition back to civilian life. As he approached his assigned seat, looking forward to finally resting before the emotional reunion that awaited him, James had no idea that this flight would become memorable for reasons he couldn't yet imagine. James made his way down the narrow aisle of the first-class cabin, counting the row numbers as he went. The soft lighting and spacious seats were a stark contrast to the military transport planes he'd grown accustomed to. A few businessmen glanced up from their laptops as he passed, some offering small nods of acknowledgement. When he reached row 3, James double-checked his boarding pass. Seat 3A, window seat. But someone was already sitting there. A woman with perfectly styled blonde hair was arranging her designer purse in the seat next to her. She wore expensive-looking clothes and had sunglasses pushed up on her head, despite being inside the airplane. "Excuse me, ma'am," James said politely, his voice soft from tiredness. "I think that might be my seat." He held out his boarding pass to show her the seat assignment. The woman barely looked up at first, continuing to arrange her belongings. When she finally did turn her attention to him, her eyes moved slowly from his face to his uniform and back again. Her expression shifted subtly, a slight tightening around her mouth. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice carrying a note of dismissal. "This is first class." She emphasized the words as if they explained everything. James stood patiently in the aisle, aware of people trying to board behind him. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. I was upgraded to first class." He showed her his boarding pass again. "My assignment is seat 3A. The woman took his boarding pass this time, examining it with narrowed eyes as if looking for a forgery. A faint frown appeared between her perfectly shaped eyebrows. "Well, there's been some type of error," she said, handing it back to him. "I always sit in this seat when I fly this route, which is monthly. The airline knows me." A flight attendant noticed the hold-up in the boarding process and approached them with a professional smile. "Is there an issue I can help with?" she asked, her voice pleasant but efficient. "Yes," the woman said immediately. "There's been a mistake with the seating." "My boarding pass says seat 3A, James explained, showing it to the flight attendant. He didn't want to cause a scene, but after 30 hours of travel, all he wanted was to sit down and rest before seeing his family. The flight attendant glanced at his pass and nodded. "That's correct, sir. 3A is your assigned seat for this flight." She turned to the woman. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass, please?" With visible reluctance, the woman rummaged through her purse and produced her own boarding pass. The flight attendant checked it and smiled apologetically. "Ma'am, your assigned seat is actually 3C, the aisle seat in this same row. It seems you're sitting in the wrong seat." The woman's face flushed slightly. "That can't be right. I specifically requested a window seat. I always get a window seat." Her voice had risen, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "I apologize for any confusion," the flight attendant said calmly, "but the system shows that Sergeant Wilson here was assigned 3A. If you'd like, I can check if there's another window seat available in first class." "I'm not moving," the woman declared, settling more firmly into the seat. "I've been a loyalty member for 15 years. I'm not giving up my window seat." She looked straight ahead, ignoring both James and the flight attendant. Other passengers began to whisper. A few took out phones, perhaps sensing a scene developing. James felt a flush of embarrassment spreading across his face. After months of commanding respect in his unit, being treated like an unwelcome intruder was jarring. "Ma'am." The flight attendant tried again, her voice lower but firmer. "This seat is assigned to Sergeant Wilson. I need to ask you to move to your assigned seat." The woman looked up at James, her eyes challenging. "And why exactly does he get a window seat over a long-standing customer?" "Because of that uniform. Do you know how much I pay to fly this airline every month?" The cabin grew uncomfortably quiet as passengers watched the scene unfold. James remained silent, too tired to argue and not wanting to make the situation worse. He just wanted to get home. The line of passengers waiting to board had come to a complete stop. A few people craned their necks to see what was causing the delay. James shifted uncomfortably, acutely aware of being the center of unwanted attention. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said, her professional smile beginning to strain, "everyone on this flight has an assigned seat. Your ticket clearly shows 3C. She gestured toward the aisle seat. "Sergeant Wilson's ticket shows 3A. It's a simple matter of sitting in your proper seat." The woman crossed her arms. "I've been a platinum member for years. I specifically request window seats for my anxiety. Your airline should accommodate loyal customers." She spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, as if gathering witnesses for her case. A middle-aged man in a business suit several rows back called out, "Some of us would like to get seated before next Christmas." A few passengers chuckled nervously. The flight attendant's smile vanished completely. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that you're delaying the boarding process. If you refuse to sit in your assigned seat, I'll need to call the captain." Another flight attendant appeared at her colleague's side, whispering something in her ear. The first attendant nodded and turned back to the situation. "Look," the woman said, lowering her voice but not her intensity, "surely he doesn't care which seat he gets." She gestured dismissively toward James without looking at him. "It's not like soldiers fly first class regularly anyway. I'm sure he'd be fine with the aisle seat." James had remained quiet throughout the exchange, years of military discipline keeping his expression neutral despite his growing frustration. He was too exhausted for confrontation. All he wanted was to sit down before his legs gave out from fatigue. "Actually," he finally spoke, his voice steady but tired, "the airline upgraded me as a thank you for service. I've been traveling for over 30 hours to get home to my family. I'd really appreciate having my assigned seat." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Well, I paid full price for my ticket. I didn't get a handout." A few gasps came from the growing audience of passengers. The second flight attendant stepped forward. "Ma'am, that comment was inappropriate. Sergeant Wilson's upgrade was provided by the airline as a gesture of appreciation for his service to our country." "Whatever," the woman said, waving her hand. "I'm not moving. You'll have to drive me out of this seat." She pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, ignoring everyone around her. The lead flight attendant spoke into her radio, requesting assistance from the gate agent. The standoff was becoming a spectacle. Some passengers had their phones out, potentially recording the incident. James felt a tightening in his chest. After months in a war zone, this petty conflict seemed absurd, yet somehow he couldn't simply walk away from it. That seat represented something more now, basic respect. "Is there another first-class seat I could take?" he asked the flight attendant quietly, hoping to end the situation. She checked her tablet. "I'm sorry, Sergeant. The flight is completely full. Every seat is assigned." She looked genuinely apologetic. The woman smirked slightly, taking his question as a sign of surrender. "See? Problem solved. He's willing to sit somewhere else." "That's not what I said, ma'am," James replied, finding a strength in his voice that came from months of commanding respect in difficult situations. "I was trying to find a solution, but it seems we're at an impasse." The captain emerged from the cockpit, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the cabin. Tall and imposing in his uniform, he assessed the situation with a quick glance. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension. The flight attendant summarized the situation efficiently. The captain listened, then turned to the woman with a stern expression. "Ma'am, you have two options. You can move to your assigned seat immediately, or you can deplane and we'll rebook you on a later flight. Those are your only choices. We have a schedule to maintain." The woman's face flushed with anger. "Do you know who I am? I'll have your job for this. I'll call your corporate office right now." "That's your right," the captain said calmly. "But first, you need to make your decision. What will it be?" The entire cabin waited in tense silence for her answer. The woman stared defiantly at the captain, her lips pressed into a thin line. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her decision. Just as she opened her mouth to respond, a deep, gravelly voice broke through the tension. "Excuse me." All heads turned toward the sound. 3 rows back, an elderly man was struggling to stand up. He wore a faded navy blue cap with gold embroidery that read Vietnam Veteran. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen much in his lifetime, and his eyes held a quiet but unmistakable authority. "I couldn't help but overhear this situation," he said, his voice steady despite his age. "And I feel I need to say something." The captain nodded respectfully. "Go ahead, sir." The elderly man looked directly at the woman. "Ma'am, I've been sitting here listening to you argue about a seat assignment, and I have to tell you, it breaks my heart." He paused, adjusting his veteran's cap slightly. "That young man standing there hasn't been home in over a year. He's been in places you and I can only imagine, doing work that keeps us safe enough to worry about window seats on airplanes." The cabin was completely silent now. Even the woman seemed momentarily lost for words. "When I came home from Vietnam in '72, the older man continued, nobody wanted to give up their seat for me. In fact, some folks didn't want to sit anywhere near me." He chuckled sadly. "Times have changed some, but not enough, it seems." He took a step into the aisle, steadying himself on the seats. "My name's Robert Hayes, retired Colonel, United States Army. I recognized the insignia on the sergeant's uniform right away. That's the same unit my son served in." James looked at Colonel Hayes with new interest, noting the mix of pride and pain that crossed the older man's face when he mentioned his son. "He was killed in action 10 years ago," Colonel Hayes said quietly. "So whenever I see someone from his unit, it's like seeing a piece of him." The woman's expression had changed. The defiance was fading, replaced by something less certain. "Now, I know you're frustrated about your seat," Colonel Hayes said to her directly. "But I hope you can understand that some things are bigger than airline status. That young man has earned that seat not just by buying a ticket, but by putting his life on the line for people he'll never even meet." A few passengers nodded in agreement. Someone near the back began to clap, and soon several others joined in. The woman looked around, suddenly aware that she had no allies in this battle. "I didn't," she began, then stopped. "I wasn't trying to." She looked down at her hands, then back up at Colonel Hayes and finally at James. "I just always get a window seat," she finished lamely. The captain, who had been watching silently, spoke up again. "Ma'am, I need your decision now. Will you move to your assigned seat, or will you need to be rebooked?" The woman gathered her belongings without meeting anyone's eyes. "I'll move," she said, her voice barely audible. As she stood up, Colonel Hayes nodded approvingly. "Thank you, ma'am. That's the right choice." James finally took his rightful seat by the window, nodding gratefully to Colonel Hayes. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. "No need for thanks, son," the older man replied. "I'm just sorry you had to deal with this after everything else." The boarding process resumed, passengers filing past with curious glances. The woman sat stiffly in her aisle seat, staring straight ahead, a flush of embarrassment visible on her cheeks. When the flight attendant came by to check that James was settled, she leaned down and whispered, "Thank you for your patience, Sergeant, and thank you for your service." She shot a quick glance at Colonel Hayes. "Both of you." As the final preparations for takeoff began, James looked out his window at the airport tarmac. After all the chaos, he was finally on the last leg of his journey home. He turned to Colonel Hayes, 2 rows behind him, and their eyes met in silent understanding. The plane took off smoothly, leaving the drama of the boarding process behind as it climbed into clear blue skies. James closed his eyes briefly, letting the tension of the confrontation drain away. When he opened them again, he found Colonel Hayes standing in the aisle beside his seat. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" the older man asked, gesturing to the empty middle seat between James and the woman, who was now pretending to be deeply absorbed in a magazine. "Please do, sir," James replied, straightening up out of habit. Military courtesy was ingrained in him, especially toward a superior officer, even a retired one. Colonel Hayes eased himself into the seat with a slight wince. "These old bones don't much care for flying anymore," he said with a wry smile. "But sometimes you've got to go where you've got to go." James nodded. "I appreciate what you did back there, sir. You didn't have to step in." "Yes, I did," Colonel Hayes said simply. He glanced at the woman, who was still determinedly avoiding eye contact. "Sometimes people forget that underneath that uniform is someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father." He looked back at James. "You have kids?" "2," James said, his face softening. He pulled out his phone and showed the older man a photo of a young boy and girl, both grinning widely. "Tommy's 7, and Lisa just turned 5 last month. I missed her birthday." Colonel Hayes studied the photo, smiling. "Good-looking kids. They take after their mother, I hope," he joked. James laughed, the first genuine laugh he had in a long time. "My wife says the same thing." The flight attendant approached with the drink cart, offering them beverages. After she moved on, Colonel Hayes turned serious. "I meant what I said earlier. About my son," he said, his voice lower now. "Staff Sergeant David Hayes. He served with the 82nd Airborne. Same as you." James's eyes widened slightly. "I know that name. Hayes." He thought for a moment. "There's a memorial plaque at the base. He was part of Operation Red Wings, wasn't he?" Colonel Hayes nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's my boy. 10 years gone this July. He's a legend among the newer guys," James said earnestly. "They tell stories about him during training, how he went back for his team." A single tear slipped down Colonel Hayes's weathered cheek. He wiped it away quickly. "Sorry about that. Still gets me, even after all this time." "No apology needed, sir," James said quietly. From the aisle seat, the woman was now openly listening, her magazine forgotten in her lap. The hostility had faded from her face, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. "Is that why you're traveling?" James asked. "Something to do with your son?" Colonel Hayes nodded. "Anniversary ceremony. They're adding his name to a new memorial wall. Didn't want to miss it." "I'd be honored to attend, if that would be all right," James offered impulsively. The older man looked genuinely touched. "I'd like that. David would have liked that too." He paused. "You know, it helps to see young men like you coming home. Reminds me that there's a purpose to it all, that some get to come back to their families." The flight attendant returned. "Colonel Hayes, I need to ask you to return to your seat for meal service, but you're welcome to visit again after." Colonel Hayes nodded and slowly stood up. Before heading back to his seat, he placed a hand briefly on James's shoulder. "Thank you, son, not just for what you did over there, but for talking to an old man about his boy." As Colonel Hayes made his way back to his seat, the woman finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said, not quite looking at James. "About your friend's son, and about before." James looked at her, seeing her clearly for the first time, not as an adversary, but as a person who'd made a mistake. "Thank you," he said simply. Outside the window, America passed beneath them, states and lives and stories connected in ways not always visible from the ground. The flight attendants had just finished clearing away the meal trays when a young boy of about 8 wandered up the aisle toward James. He stopped beside the seat, fidgeting nervously with the hem of his superhero t-shirt. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said, his voice small but determined. "My dad told me you're a real-life hero, like in the movies." James smiled warmly. "What's your name, buddy?" "Tommy," the boy replied. "Like your son," he grinned, revealing a missing front tooth. James was surprised. "How did you know my son's name?" "I heard you talking to the old soldier man," Tommy explained. "My dad says you fight bad guys and keep us safe." The woman in the aisle seat shifted uncomfortably, fixing her gaze out the window across James's seat. "Well, Tommy," James said, "there are lots of heroes. Doctors, teachers, firefighters. I just do my job, same as them." "Can I shake your hand?" the boy asked suddenly. "Dad says that's what you do when you meet someone important." James extended his hand, and Tommy shook it with comical seriousness. "It's an honor to meet you, sir," he said, clearly repeating words he'd been taught. As Tommy scampered back to his seat, a middle-aged man in a business suit stopped by. "Sorry to bother you," he said, "but I wanted to thank you as well. My brother served 2 tours in Iraq. It means a lot, what you folks do." One by one, passengers began to make their way to James's seat during the flight. Some just offered a quick thank you, others shared stories of family members who had served. A retired teacher gave him a handwritten note to read later. A young woman mentioned that her sister was currently deployed overseas. The woman in the aisle seat witnessed it all, her expression gradually shifting from embarrassment to something more thoughtful. Each time someone approached, she seemed to shrink a little smaller into her seat. After about an hour of these visits, Colonel Hayes made his way back to James. "Looks like you've become the most popular man on this flight," he said with a chuckle. James shook his head. "Just people being kind." "It's more than that," Colonel Hayes said. "People need heroes, especially nowadays. They need to believe in something good." The flight attendant approached with a small cake topped with a single candle. "The crew pooled together to get this," she explained. "A little welcome home present." James was visibly moved. "That's incredibly thoughtful. Thank you." The woman in the aisle seat suddenly spoke up. "You can put it on my tray table," she offered, clearing away her things. "You'll have more room." Both men looked at her, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you," James said, genuinely appreciative of the small olive branch. As the flight attendant set down the cake, several passengers noticed and began to applaud spontaneously. The sound spread throughout the cabin until nearly everyone was clapping. James felt his cheeks grow warm with embarrassment, but Colonel Hayes patted his shoulder. "Let them have this moment," he said quietly. "It's not just for you." The woman seemed to make a decision. She turned fully toward James for the first time. "I behaved terribly earlier," she said, her voice steady despite obvious discomfort. "The truth is, I was having a horrible day before I even got on this plane. My mother's in the hospital, and I'm worried sick about her. But that's no excuse for how I treated you." James nodded, acknowledging her words. "I've been watching everyone come up to thank you," she continued. "It made me realize how small I was being. Over a window seat, of all things." She shook her head. "I'm truly sorry." "Apology accepted," James said simply. The woman smiled tentatively. "Would you like more cake?" "I'm not going to eat mine." As James, Colonel Hayes, and the woman shared the welcome home cake, the atmosphere in their row had transformed completely from the tension of boarding. Outside the window, the landscape below was changing too, as they flew closer to James's home and family. The plane began its descent, the seatbelt signs chiming on as the pilot announced they would be landing in 20 minutes. James looked out the window at the familiar landscape of his home state emerging from the clouds below. After 15 months away, the sight made his heart beat faster. "Almost home," Colonel Hayes remarked, returning to his own seat for landing. "Those kids of yours are in for quite a surprise." James smiled. "I can hardly believe it myself. Feels like a dream after so long." The woman beside him had been quiet for some time, but now she spoke again. "Do they know you're coming today?" "No," James replied. "My wife thinks I'm still a week away. I wanted to surprise them." She nodded thoughtfully. "That's going to be a wonderful moment for them." As the plane touched down with a gentle bump and taxied toward the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "I work for a photography studio," she explained, handing it to James. "I'd like to offer you a free family portrait session when you're settled. It's the least I can do." James accepted the card with surprise. "That's very generous. Thank you." Sometimes we need reminders of what's important, she said simply. When the seatbelt sign turned off, something unexpected happened. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, before we deplane, I'd like to ask for your patience for just a moment. We have a special passenger with us today. Sergeant James Wilson is returning home after 15 months of service overseas. I'd like to ask that we allow him to deplane first so he can reunite with his family. A spontaneous round of applause filled the cabin. James felt a lump form in his throat as he stood, gathering his duffel bag. Passengers smiled and reached out to pat his shoulder as he made his way down the aisle. Colonel Hayes waited for him near the exit. I'll be attending my son's memorial ceremony tomorrow at Arlington National Cemetery, 2 o'clock, he said. If you're able to come, I'd appreciate it. I'll be there, sir, James promised, shaking the older man's hand firmly. As James stepped into the jetway, he could hear the continued applause behind him. The woman who had caused such a scene earlier stood at the plane door, waiting her turn. I learned something today, she said as he passed. Thank you for that lesson. James nodded, offering a smile of genuine forgiveness. Safe travels. I hope your mother gets better soon. Walking through the terminal, James felt lighter with each step. The tension and exhaustion of the long journey were being replaced by growing excitement. As he rounded the corner toward the main concourse, he spotted them immediately, his wife holding their daughter's hand, his son bouncing excitedly beside them, all three scanning the arriving passengers without yet seeing him. He stopped for a moment, taking in the sight of them. His wife looked beautiful, her hair different than when he'd left. His daughter had grown so much he hardly recognized her. His son was taller, more like a little man than the child he'd left behind. James took a deep breath and walked toward them. His son spotted him first, eyes widening in disbelief before he broke into a sprint. DDDY. The boy's shout cut through the airport noise like a bell. James dropped his duffel bag just in time to catch his son, lifting him high into the air as his wife and daughter ran toward them, faces transformed with joy and surprise. Behind him, Colonel Hayes watched from a distance, a bittersweet smile on his weathered face. Nearby, other travelers paused to witness the reunion, many wiping away tears at the sight. And in that moment, all the hardships of deployment, the exhaustion of the journey, and even the unpleasantness of the earlier confrontation faded away. James was home, holding his family close, making every sacrifice worthwhile.